This is a conversation with Lennart Meschmayer. Lennart is a researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich, who's focusing on cyber warfare, how states use cyber power against each other, both in times of war and peace, and what role does cyber play in conflicts today. And that's exactly what this conversation is all about. We talk about what role does cyber play in the war in Ukraine, why we haven't seen a cyber apocalypse that many have predicted before the war started, why cyber warfare looks really differently than most people think, why Israel is a hacking superpower, or what would a cyber war between Russia and NATO look like. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And it's also supported by generous patrons that you can join to help make this sustainable and get a lot of different perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
If we're going to be talking about cyber warfare, which is definitely in terms of different methods of war and conflict, it's definitely on the newer side. Before we talk about what does it look like today, I think it makes sense to start with how we got there and talk a little bit about the evolution of this space. So can you maybe talk briefly about how did we get here? Since when can we actually talk about cyber as part of conflicts and sort of interstate competition, and how has it evolved since it first appeared on the radar?
Yeah, sure. It's a challenge to keep it short, obviously. I think
you can take your time as well.
One point to start with, and you already mentioned it, right? I think it's important to clarify really what I'm talking about with this topic, because cyber warfare, this activity is really kind of a game of smoke and mirrors, using new technology that's complex and kind of ubiquitous, but still not very well understood by a lot of people. So there's a lot of kind of myth building around it. And in many ways, it has been cyber conflict or cyber warfare has really been kind of a world where everything seems possible, where the greatest hopes and the greatest fears about the future of conflict, kind of depending on where you stand, are possible, might turn true. But what I've been showing in my research is really that it's neither as novel nor as revolutionary as it's often seen. And that's by looking at the mechanism that's involved. And that mechanism, if you put it most simply in cyber warfare, is really the politically motivated use of hacking. And that means getting access to computer systems, exploiting vulnerabilities, and then manipulating those systems to do things they're not supposed to do from their designers or users' perspective. And so if you think about that mechanism, this is really about subverting computer systems, subverting the networks that we increasingly depend on. And this subversive nature of hacking is really well understood by technical experts. If you read, reports, it's often mentioned that subverting the security mechanism. There are papers going back to the 80s. I think one I saw from the Naval War College that talks about the subversion of computer systems. So on the technical side, that's well understood. But on the kind of political side, both policy people, academics, that subversive nature and that mechanism and the consequences of that strategically haven't really been examined that much. So instead, mostly it's about, as I said, it's about the technology, right? And the kind of possibilities, the novelty that come from it. And that's often seen in a military context. So, I'm looking at the geopolitical context. I'll talk a lot more about that later, but just that to kind of clarify what this all refers to. So this political use of cyber operations then goes back basically 3 decades now. One of the earliest cases, and a book that I'm just reading that I'm really enjoying, is the Cuckoo's Egg operation, where astronomer actually working at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California discovered this intrusion into their computer system, and then kind of doggedly pursued that, and finally managed over a year's work or so, with little support from federal institutions, discovered this broad espionage campaign that was targeting a bunch of military targets in the US and kind of sensitive research facilities, run from Germany by a hacker that turned out was paid by the KGB, the Soviet intelligence service. And since then, states have used this tool, used cyber operations both to steal information, but also to disrupt systems, damage them, manipulate information, delete information, and so on, more and more. So it's not really that we have like specific events that kind of changed everything. It's more of its gradual evolution. States are using this tool more and more, and it's become more and more integral in a way because of that to power politics competition. So it's one among many tools that states are using to get advantages over others. And of course, there are a few key moments where, this activity then became really visible and kind of it became clear how important it's become. So one key event is in 2007, Estonia, where there was this spat basically between Russia and Estonia about this removal of a statue. And then at that time, in response to this, there was a lot of cyber activity that probably was coordinated by the Russian state. And that was seen as a milestone really in the use of cyber warfare to start to disrupt and cause damage in another country, even though the damage was not very severe. It was mostly really disruptive activity. And that led in the end to the establishment of that NATO Center of Excellence in Estonia, which has now become a leading country in that space. So it's become, basically, to put it short, it was kind of a fringe activity. The book I just mentioned is about this lone geek who's tracking down this hacker, another geek basically in the networks, they are both embroiled in this kind of international politics, but without the recognition of that going on, at least on the American side at the time, where the book is full about this guy trying to get support from CIA or from the FBI, and they keep telling him like, well, nothing, there hasn't been no damage caused. And that obviously has changed. It's been recognized as, increasingly relevant to national security.
And I guess a part of that is that today we have a lot more systems that can be hacked than maybe before. I can imagine that, the planes or tanks or kind of military equipment that is being used today by NATO militaries compared with the different tanks that maybe they would use 20, 30 years ago that didn't really have as many electronic components that can be hacked. Whereas today, they might be actually more vulnerable. So the potential effect that you can achieve is maybe greater.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think something to keep in mind with this activity, right? Because often it's described as a cyber weapon. You have cyber capabilities and you use them to project power. And it's this analogy to military capabilities, which are, maybe a missile. You have a bunch of missiles and you shoot them at a target and they create a certain amount of damage. And that amount of damage, this kind of explosive potential they have, or if you have bombs, or even if it's tanks, right? That's independent really of the target. The damage it causes depends on how well armored the target is or not. But with cyber operations, you always depend on having some target that's available that also has vulnerabilities you can exploit. So that really limits the applicability. And I think the example you just gave is a great one. Also probably explaining why we haven't really seen this military effects that many people have predicted for a long time. Because a lot of military systems are not really networked to the extent and, computerized that it would be possible and effective really to target them with hacking in order to, in the ideal case, I guess you want to blow them up or destroy them, right? That might change in the future. So that's something to consider with this idea of, we need more and more smart systems, but you also get more vulnerabilities that way.
I definitely want to talk about that in more detail. But before we get to it, if we stay on the evolution of the cyber warfare for a little bit longer, I think that for me and for almost anyone who knows a little bit about security and geopolitics, but is not an expert on cyber warfare, the one event that they heard about was the STX virus, which I think was in 2008, which was basically an Israeli-American virus targeting Iranian nuclear facilities. And that is probably the most famous state-backed cyber incident so far. And I wonder if that was really such a big paradigm-shifting thing, or if it kind of just had a good PR and it was one of many such attacks that took place, but we never heard of them.
So, yeah, it's interesting, that case, because if you look at how expectation had evolved at that time, it was really more paradigm confirming than paradigm shifting, because over the early 2000s, or starting in the early 2000s, there were more and more of these predictions and expectations and fears around cyber war, right? So the use of cyber operations to produce some damage similar to military attacks. Some people argued that, the future of warfare is cyber war. You don't need mass and mobility like, in aerial warfare anymore, which is interesting. Also, there's a parallel to 100 years ago when the first airplanes arrived. There was the prediction that we would no longer have ground troops because you can just, fly over them and bomb whatever target you want. And similar expectations around cyber warfare, that you can reach around the globe and, project power where you want. And this operation confirmed that expectation in a way. So it was seen as kind of a watershed moment at that time, as the first act of cyber war, of real cyber war, where a cyber operation succeeded to cause physical damage, right? This virus, the Stuxnet virus, was designed in a way that it would change the rotating speed of uranium enrichment centrifuges in Iran, and in that way damaged them. And it damaged apparently a considerable number of them. So technically that was a huge success. And it was seen as this evolution of warfare, and this watershed moment. People called it a cyber cruise missile at the time. But what it also showed, this operation, and the reason why we haven't actually seen many operations of this kind, is not that this keeps happening, we don't know about it. I mean, it's possible, but I don't think, there would be, if there was a world where there is constantly this kind of sabotage going on, that we would not ultimately hear about it, especially if it's against high-profile targets of this kind. For example, Israel tends to kind of take covert ownership of a lot of these operations they run through, anonymous kind of leaks. The US does the same. They also did this with Stuxnet. So from all that we know, there haven't really been many operations. This is a very special and kind of exquisite capability that the US used here. And that's what's striking about it, because this ultimately, what later investigations showed, it took about 5 years of preparations to get to this point of, damaging some of these centrifuges. And a few excellent papers by some academics have also shown that the strategic impact that this operation had compared to this huge investment, not only 5 years of preparation, probably also hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, because it looks like they had to basically build a replica of this facility in order to test out this targeting mechanism and the manipulation. And so on the one hand, the damage that it caused is almost certainly far less than the costs of the operation. Rebecca Slayton has written a paper on that. And then John Lindsay, another academic, he showed that at best, this whole operation slowed down the Iranian nuclear program by maybe a few months. But actually, even at the time when it was active, when it was damaging these centrifuges there, the overall rate of enrichment was actually increasing at the facility. So if you look at the larger strategic context, and assuming the goal, which is quite clear in this case, was to delay and kind of derail the Iranian nuclear program as much as possible, the strategic impact on that is really very limited. And the most striking aspect of it then is putting it in this larger context, looking at what Mossad has done after this, because they have targeted the same facility multiple times. In 2020, 2021, there were these unexplained explosions there that really ripped a huge hole into the facility, and also a power outage that just, caused a blackout there. And in both cases, the first reactions, if you read news reporting on it, were again, there was a cyber attack here. But it turned out in both cases, there was no real cyber component at all. Instead, it was a bomb bombs that were smuggled into the facility, hidden there, and then blew up and caused this damage. Which kind of goes to show, if your aim is to cause physical destruction, traditional means bombs are in most circumstances probably more effective. And that seems to be also the conclusion that the Israelis have drawn based on this, since they went back to these traditional means. So contrary to that prediction at the time when it happened that, this is the future of warfare, we will see much more of these kinds of operations. It's really been the opposite. There are some cases of, physical effects, power outages. Russia succeeded to cause those in Ukraine, but they're still relatively rare. And in each case, you see that the efforts required, the resources required to achieve them is really dwarfs kind of the effect that they have achieved, which underlines that the more kind of damage you want to cause in that context, the less effective cyber operations, cyber attacks tend to become as an instrument to achieve that outcome.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. So you think that's the main reason why we haven't seen more of these high-impact operations, that the cost versus return ratio just doesn't make that much sense?
Yeah, that's it, at least what the evidence tells us from these operations. The problem is, I think, or the tendency in a lot of the commentary and predictions that focuses really on what's technically possible. And a lot of things are technically possible, but that doesn't really consider then the strategic calculations of the actors that deploy these capabilities, right? So, I think a cheap analogy would be if you want to go to work in the morning, it's pretty far away and maybe you're pressed for time. You could use your bike. You might still make it in time, but you could also use your car, which is going to be far easier. And, you'd also be able to pick up your kids on the way back or whatever you need to do. And it's a bit like that. So if, you have this kind of goal, you want to cause some damage, especially physical damage, you could use cyber operations. And in some context, they might still be the best available option if, for whatever reason, you don't have physical access to the target or it's too risky, whatever the reason might be. But in most circumstances, there are probably other options, traditional means of, just causing damage, sabotage, getting agents into the facility as Israel has done. And in most circumstances, those will probably be more attractive because they look more likely to succeed and might also require less resources.
That's really interesting because not that long ago, I've heard someone talk about how there is a big risk of modern tanks specifically, but also all modern military equipment that has so much electronics that it could potentially be hacked and sort of taken over. But I guess what you're saying is that probably it would still be a lot easier and cheaper to just blow them up rather than trying to hack them.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. We don't really know the vulnerabilities of a lot of these new capabilities. The F-35 jet is a good example that through its development history has received quite a bit of kind of critical and worrisome analysis commentary revealing a bunch of vulnerabilities in these software systems. We don't know how many of them have been patched, and we also don't know what adversaries know about this. So I would hope that most of these vulnerabilities are patched by now, and that is also very hard to actually be able to exploit them and, then systematically kind of down a whole fleet. But the strategic promise of doing that is, of course, great, which would, then if you think of the strategic calculus, if there is at least a realistic possibility, you'd be able to not only, destroy individual targets, so individual tanks, but in the moment of, escalation, when you start an invasion, for example, be able to disable or at least degrade in a way an entire fleet of these tanks or airplanes. That would be a huge strategic advantage, right? So I would expect states that know there might be a vulnerability to then invest heavily in that capability or in the ability to exploit these vulnerabilities. And that also means that the more there are these networked and computerized, really, platforms on the battlefield, the higher the chance becomes that we do see ultimately some effective use of hacking on the front lines in a military conflict. So I think overall I would agree with that statement, but the same kind of caveats apply, that it's extremely challenging to produce these kind of effects, and especially against sensitive targets where security is obviously the priority in the design. That doesn't mean that there are not going to be vulnerabilities. That's the other reality. No matter how secure you try to make a system, there will always be vulnerabilities as long as we don't have godlike creatures that are infallible and create them some advanced AI. But then we will have other problems.
So I think at this point it makes sense to talk about the war in Ukraine, because I think it tested out a lot of these ideas that we're talking about in practice. And maybe a good way to start would be, before the war began, you wrote an article that I really liked on how might the cyber aspect of the war look. And you discussed in the article 3 perspectives of what the strategic role of cyber in conflicts and wars is or could be. So could you maybe explain what these 3 perspectives are?
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're really also related to that evolution of expectations around cyber operations. The first one I already discussed at the beginning, that's really about cyber operations as a means of war, as a means of force projection, like, the Stuxnet kind of scenario. But then those haven't really played out, and accordingly, then expectations really also shifted over the years, that, maybe cyber operations are not able to deliver these decisive kind of strategic strikes. That means that they can become means of war of that kind, but rather can be complements to the use of force. So that would be the scenario of sabotaging equipment that we were just talking about. In that way, facilitating and enhancing the use of your conventional capabilities and acting as a force multiplier, as it's often called. But also, we haven't seen many of those. And instead, most of cyber conflict, most activity has really stayed below that threshold of armed conflict, of escalation. And in response to that, again, expectations have really shifted, especially over the last 5 years. And here, the election interference in the US in 2016, I think that was a really watershed moment, because up to then, the fear was a cyber Pearl Harbor scenario, this kind of strategic strike against critical infrastructure, all that. And most of the efforts have focused on defending against this kind of threat. And then here came Russia and used really kind of low-level activity to plausibly, alter or at least influence the outcomes of the election. There was a threat that hadn't been considered at all. So after that, the whole focus has really shifted in the US, and now also the strategy and a lot of the theory underlying it, in expecting or in arguing that cyber operations are not as relevant in warfare, but rather this technological innovation that they offer and the kind of enhancement of the operations and the effects you can produce and the effectiveness that you have with these is mostly relevant below the threshold of armed escalation. And the great expectation has been, and that underlies the whole strategy of persistent engagement, that in an ideal scenario, you can produce strategic gains that might even substitute the use of force in a way that you couldn't previously do. So that states basically can shift the balance of power without going to war in a way that they couldn't previously do.
So if we go to Ukraine, what was the expectation there before the Russian invasion and before the war began? And how the cyber element then actually was in reality as opposed to what we might have expected?
Yeah, basically a lot of the expectations around cyber war and, this critical infrastructure strikes, they came up again, and I'm sure you saw it too, right? A lot of the news reporting before the invasion started. And one of the arguments was that, actually we have never seen, until then, we had never seen the use of cyber warfare in a major conventional conflict. And for various reasons, mostly this expectation of deterrence that basically Russia had held back its most kind of exquisite, most damaging capabilities before out of fear of escalation, or just also because they wanted to keep them for this kind of case of escalation. So the idea was basically Russia had more powerful capabilities, and a lot of the reporting also before always kind of went in that direction, right? In 2019, I remember there was the discovery that Russia had compromised a bunch of critical infrastructure in the US. And the reporting suggested that this was in preparation of, eventual escalation, and this demonstrated Russia's capabilities of, basically bringing down the power grid, for example, in those scenarios. And those were the same as the expectations in this case for Ukraine. That's also why I published this article you mentioned with Nadia Kosti, where we're pushing back against these expectations, saying that they're probably unrealistic because they underestimate and kind of also ignore in some cases the limitations of these capabilities that we've also seen on the Russian side. So Russia, yes, did succeed to disrupt the power grid in Ukraine before, but that also took extensive preparations and ultimately was, a regionally limited outage that only affected a few 100,000 people. I mean, it's a large number of people, but very small compared to the size of the country. And also in a rural area where it had really no measurable strategic impact. So our point was that we should also not only consider what's possible in theory, but look at what Russia has actually achieved and the flaws we see, the shortcomings in their capabilities leading up to this escalation, and what would be realistic to expect because or based on what they had done. And our point was that most likely we would see the kind of same type of activity, which is really kind of mostly opportunistic, disruptive activity that stays below these kind of doomsday scenarios of massive outages and critical infrastructure strikes. And that's also what we saw in practice, that, Russia tried to do a lot of things. There was a lot of activity, as you would expect, because, it's a war, and whatever advantage you can gain, you will try to gain. And cyber operations are one of the tools available. So, why not try to maximize what you get from them? But most of the activity was really, kind of a nuisance for people, especially in the beginning. There were these website defacements. That was the first thing in January 2022, posting the threatening message on several government websites to tell people to be very afraid that all their data will be leaked. That had very little impact, though, also because Ukrainians have been exposed to these kinds of things from Russia for a long time and kind of know how to deal with it. They mostly make fun of it now, which I think is a very good defense against this kind of attacks. And then a lot of wiper attacks that are still ongoing, basically just deleting data similar to ransomware or encrypting data so that systems get disabled. But they were quite low or small in scale, and because of that low in intensity, didn't really have any kind of blanket effects. There is no indication that they stopped or hampered Ukraine's effectiveness in responding to the invasion. A lot of these wipers targeted government organizations at that time. There is one operation that stands out, though. That's the Viasat hack of this satellite communications system, KSAT, run by Viasat, that was also used by Ukraine's military and was disrupted by what we now know was malware by Sandworm, most likely the Russian hacking group, that basically just bricked all these satellite modems that were used for this service at the very time the invasion started. So that meant that the Ukrainian military didn't have one of their communications channels available. So there is a very kind of plausible scenario where this provided at least tactical advantages for the Russian side. And that was the initial commentary on that operation. But since then, sources from Ukraine have come out and said, well, actually, this didn't have any impact on military operations because these units had alternative communications channels. They could rely on, maybe mobile phones or whatever else, just radio, whatever else they had available, so that it didn't really impact their ability to operate on the battlefield. And again, this was something that probably took 2 years to prepare from what we know. And at least it didn't provide a big strategic advantage. That's for certain right now. We saw how the invasion went, right? Ukraine was far more effective in its response than expected. And if you assume there was a really kind of blanket systematic impact of this operation on military forces, it's very unlikely that the actual battle would have gone the way that it did. So all of the evidence that we have now, and of course it's an ongoing conflict, is also in Ukraine's interest perhaps to downplay the effects of some of these operations. But on the other hand, they also benefit from, revealing it because they're relying on Western support. But in any case, the evidence we have now is that these operations before and during and also shortly after the invasion did not really significantly alter the course of the war or provide some decisive or really even significant strategic advantage for Russia.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. It's launching from January, it's completely free, and you can already sign up so that you receive the first edition. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. And now, back to the conversation. What's your view, to sort of follow up on some of the attacks that you mentioned, what's your view on the relationship between the cyber element and the information operations? Because often it seems that these two are intertwined and that cyber is often used as a way to enable or strengthen the impact of information operations.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's very clear from the Russian side that, it's one instrument in these broader active measures campaigns that Russia has been running that also go back to the Soviet times and really KGB strategies, and clear attempts to, on the one hand, use cyber operations to amplify it or effects or cause kind of confusion, but also use information operations to then amplify the effects of cyber operations or suggest there are effects when there are none. So the earliest example is in 2014, there was a cyber operation targeting Ukraine's Central Elections Commission that just disrupted all of its computer systems just before the presidential elections at the time. Fortunately, it didn't work because they had backups in place and could restore the systems in time for the vote counting to start, and then it worked flawlessly. But there was a clear kind of coordination with Russian propaganda at the time, and also a kind of fake outlet created by the hacking group. They call themselves Cyber Berkut, supposedly hacktivists, who published a statement on their website saying that, they had hacked the Ukrainian elections infrastructure to reveal the machinations of the Kiev junta and show that it's a completely illegitimate system and so on. And this was also picked up and really prominently covered by Russian state media. And that's a pattern that has continued. And Enver, and also the group that does a lot of this disruptive operations against Ukraine, has continued also this use of front organizations and of publishing, taking or claiming responsibility, even if not under their own name, for a lot of this disruptive activity, and in a way trying to bolster and exaggerate, amplify the impact that they have.
Do you think, and this is a very hypothetical and speculative question, but in a hypothetical scenario, if it wasn't Russia attacking Ukraine or a country similar to Ukraine, but it was the US, do you think that the strategic impact of cyber could have been different and could have been greater? And what I'm trying to find out here is, I guess, how big are the differences in capabilities between the major players here, and whether the limited impact of Russian cyber attacks was perhaps because of Russian limited capabilities, or because just inherently it's something that's really difficult to do, and even if it was the US, it wouldn't be that much different?
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult question in a way, because of that smoke and mirrors aspect that I mentioned at the very beginning, right? So the most basic point is we only know of those operations that were discovered. That means that especially if the sponsors of those operations didn't want to get discovered, they made a mistake at some stage. And I think in that context, it's not really a coincidence that we know a lot about these Russian operations, because they have been the most kind of daring and reckless, that also often kind of experiment and then fail in the progress, but sometimes also succeed to produce, considerable impact, at least on their immediate victims. But because of that, it's extremely hard to say, based on any kind of facts, what actors have which capabilities. It's very different to conventional military capabilities where, the size of the army, the number of planes, the number of tanks, number of ships, and so on. But what do you count for cyber capabilities, right? I mean, is it the number of computers or the number of hackers, of geeks? There is no real clear measure of that kind. And the research into that topic on, what are actually cyber capabilities, my colleague who I share an office with, Max Smith, has written a whole book on that. that shows mostly it's about really skilled personnel and then building the organizational structures that allow this skilled personnel to flourish. And that's not something that you can easily measure because that all happens behind closed doors, really. And for obvious reasons, states are not disclosing, how they're structuring these forces and how many people they might or might not have. And that means the only measure we have really to compare capabilities are past operations by different states. And as I said, we have a lot of data on Russia, but we have next to nothing on the US or China. And that poses the question, on the one hand, there is an obvious reason because most of the cybersecurity firms that publish reports, which are the main basis of information on cyber operations, they are almost all based in the US or at least in the West. And for some reason, they don't report on Western activity. So there is already a kind of inherent bias in the information that we have. And that means we don't know really what operations the US has run, how impactful they have been or not, apart from the very few that have come out, like Stuxnet or the operation against the Russian disinformation group IRA in 2018, if I remember correctly, or against ISIS. But there are just, very few examples. And similarly, on China, we know quite a bit about espionage activity, but we know very little. There are no cases really that I know of Chinese use of disruptive capabilities. There are recent developments that indicate they're working kind of more towards those, also with these implants discovered in US infrastructure. But there is just not really enough data to go by. So there is I think, reasonable argument to be made that probably the US and China are more advanced, or at least definitely more careful in the way that they use these capabilities compared to Russia. But it's not something that we can really say with any sense of certainty based on the amount of data we have. And that's on the offensive side. And on the defensive side, that's, I think, even harder to compare because you don't really have the similar scenario, right, of Ukraine that's been exposed to these kinds of operations, now is being invaded. The US has been in a very different situation. It's been targeted by cyber operations for a long time. There's a lot of kind of hype around the topic. There is a huge industry now that's working on cyber defenses, but it hasn't really been tested in the same way. And it also had most of the organizations in the US haven't been exposed to this kind of constant barrage of threats in a way that Ukrainian organizations have. And for US and Ukraine, I would hope that the US is more resilient because of all the things I just mentioned if there was a major attack. But I'm not sure that it would be, because I think one thing to really consider that's also come out of this conflict now, and really the operations that we've seen falling short out of a lot of the predictions, is this fact that Ukraine and Ukrainian network defenders have been trained for almost a decade before this invasion actually happened by this constant barrage of Russian cyber attacks. And they've just become quite good at defending against them with sometimes very simple lessons, such as just having systematic backups that are very good at defending against these kinds of vipers. And on the other hand, if you look at NATO as a whole, I would assume that there are several countries that are supposedly much more advanced than Ukraine that are probably much more vulnerable to cyber attacks than Ukraine is right now. And where I'm from, Germany, is a good example. All that we see, what we've seen from Germany, is really a lack of capabilities, also a lack of urgency in developing them and considering this threat. And most of the operations that have hit Germany, for example, its parliament or recently one of its main parties, they were discovered and then disclosed by allied intelligence services, not even German intelligence services. So if you take an example of a country that's probably much more vulnerable to these kinds of things compared to Ukraine, Germany, I think, would be very high up on my list.
If we're talking about sort of comparing these capabilities of different nation states, I do have to ask about Israel, because it's often pointed out as the hacking cyber superpower. And I wonder, to what extent can we evaluate whether that's really the case, or whether, part of it is just that they have a good PR?
Well, they do have a good PR, and they also claim responsibility often, and in a way, in doing that, also making sure to show that they have these exquisite capabilities. Also, the sabotage against Hezbollah recently, another kind of spectacular case in that context. But from what we've seen, and the STX virus, which I said was technically, really on the technical side, an immense achievement, is still among the most advanced viruses and operations at deploying that virus that we have seen out in the wild. So I think it is fair to say that Israel is among the leading nations in that space. And I think two main reasons for that. The first, that it does have quite a strong tech sector. Even though it's a small country, it has really outsized skills and infrastructure in that regard. But also a very capable intelligence service and a long tradition of relying on that intelligence service to fend off, external threats in that region. And especially as a way to, project power and defend itself without escalating to the use of force. And that's where cyber operations can, be quite useful tools. So it is not surprising that Israel has become quite good at this. And I think we shouldn't also discount the support Israel has from the US. Stuxnet was done together with the US, right? So in a way, Israel does have its own advantages, plus, the support of the world's preeminent superpower that also is home to probably by far, I think certainly the largest community of skilled workers in that space.
If I go back to Ukraine for a little bit, because we've mostly talked about what it looked like in the initial stages of the invasion, what does the cyber element or cyber warfare look like today in sort of day-to-day part of the military operations? How can I imagine what might and obviously we don't know the exact operational details because that's classified, but how can I imagine what are the people trying to do on both sides and what kind of impact it might be having? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.